Hello and welcome to the World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. I'm your host, Iya Milmashuli. This week we're talking about Russian threats to use nuclear weapons over its war in Ukraine. As the war drags on and tensions with the West continue to escalate, Russia has engaged in what some call nuclear coercion. But how serious are these threats, and could they be signaling a dangerous new phase in this war? We'll be speaking with Ian Brzezinski, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO policy, and Glenn Howard, founder and former president of the Jamestown Foundation, about the risks and what the potential use of such weapons would mean for Ukraine, Europe, and global security. Also in the show, Cipher Brief CEO and publisher Suzanne Kelly sits down with former Deputy National Security Advisor Matthew Pottinger, who is warning in his recent book, The Boiling Mode, that an invasion of Taiwan by Chinese forces would be catastrophic, and why he thinks the West needs to be doing more to prevent it. First, though, let's check in with Cipher Brief Managing Editor Tom Nagorski for an overview of other stories that were driving the news this week. Tom?
Well, we usually do a roundup of many global stories here, but this week we'll stick with one because it has so many important angles and implications. We're talking about the explosions in Lebanon this week, thousands of pagers and then walkie-talkies blowing up in people's hands and their pockets, wherever they were when the pagers and the walkie-talkies were triggered to go off. And while these were low-level explosives, it was a massive attack, two attacks really, on two different days in Lebanon, all aimed at operatives of the militant group Hezbollah. And both operations carried out, we now believe, by Israel. So story number one here, the attacks themselves, as we said on our site this week, even by the standards of Israeli high-tech operations, and they have done many of these remote control attacks recently in Tehran and Beirut. This one was unusual. Hezbollah's leaders had actually directed the organization and its members to stop using cell phones because the Israelis had gotten so good at tracking those. So that's why they turned to these old school devices. And then Israeli intelligence was apparently able to create a shell company that sold the rigged pagers and walkie-talkies to Hezbollah. As for the carnage, as I speak, 37 confirmed dead over the 2 days, including at least two children, several members, militants of the group itself, more than 3,000 wounded. And as we've noted, it's a huge psychological blow to Hezbollah, which now has to worry that all its communications may be compromised. Then, of course, there's the broader impact for the Middle East. The attacks have the entire region on edge, once again, worried about a full-scale Israel-Hezbollah conflict that could draw in Iran and spill into a major regional war. Hezbollah's leader has now said that the explosions had, quote, crossed all red lines, and he vowed to retaliate. Israel's defense minister said, quote, a new era in Israel's war effort had begun, and that, quote, the center of gravity is moving north, as in from Gaza and the war against Hamas, north to Lebanon and the war against Hezbollah. The main question for all of us watching this now, were these attacks enough to satisfy Israel's new war aims, or were they just a prelude to full-scale military operations and that bigger war? We may know the answers soon.
You probably already know that the Cipher Brief works with deeply experienced experts on global and national security to help put context around today's headlines. But did you also know that the Cipher Brief produces a daily report that keeps you up to speed on national and global security stories that are impacting businesses around the world? Like the President's Daily Brief, the Cipher Brief's open source report should be your first read of the day to stay ahead of the national and global security stories impacting your world. Become a subscriber and get the report for free. Subscribe at decipherbrief.com.
Experts tell us that the war in Ukraine has not revealed much about Russia's nuclear warfighting strategy, but it has set new precedents in nuclear coercion. Ian Brzezinski, former Assistant Secretary of Defense, argues that this nuclear coercion is dangerous not only because it weakens Ukraine, but also because it sends a message to other authoritarian regimes like China and Iran that nuclear threats can be used effectively to deter Western intervention in their own conflicts. He's concerned that rewarding Russia's nuclear coercion could eventually lead to the actual use of nuclear weapons. Ian, thank you very much for finding the time to talk to us today, and welcome to the World Deciphered.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to see you again.
Let's start from a broad question. What's your assessment of Russia's performance in Ukraine, and how does NATO see Russia from the military perspective, whether it's the weakness of Russian military or strength?
When it comes to NATO's assessment, I can't speak for NATO, but I think most NATO analysts, most NATO commanders are not impressed by Russia's military capabilities. What they see is a plotting strategy of military and societal attrition that is nonetheless, because of Russia's advantages in mass, is having a steady effect to Russia's advantage. And we see that particularly in eastern Ukraine, Donbass, where the Russians are throwing soldiers and lives away every day. Some saying 1,000 a day are being lost, Russians being killed, but they're gaining a kilometer or a few hundred yards here and there, but every day. So you can't say the Russians are losing. They're losing a lot of lives, but they're gaining territory. And this is Putin's primary objective, not the protection of his Russian lives, but the attainment of Ukrainian territory. I think a second factor that is a focus of Allied commanders and leaders is that this is a war that highlights and underscores that the world has returned to battlefields that feature high-intensity warfare. It's mass rounds of ammunition being expended with high volumes of lives being lost. And maybe a third factor that they've learned or been reminded of is that Russia can be, in this case, is a very determined adversary that has a very different value set. And difference in value set is Putin doesn't care how many lives he loses, just as long as he sees the prospect down the road of territorial gains and ultimate victory.
Let's switch gears to nuclear deterrence. Russia is a nuclear power, of course, and it's emphasizing on nuclear deterrence in its military doctrine. Now, where do you see this nuclear deterrence playing into the war in Ukraine? Do you actually see that Russia is using it as a deterrent, nuclear weapons, that is? Or do you think that there is a real chance that Russia will use nukes at some point?
I'm not sure this war has revealed anything much new about Russia's nuclear warfighting strategy and its tactics. So Putin, he's moved some nuclear weapons, for example, into Belarus, but I haven't heard evidence of him doing anything that has dramatically said that we're on the cusp of a nuclear war. There's been some reports of it, but nothing that changes our understanding of their strategy and tactics of how they actually would employ those systems. But when it comes to nuclear coercion, that is different. Nuclear coercion has been a key element of Russia's strategy in the invasion of Ukraine. And it's been particularly prominent during the February 2022 invasion, where Putin preceded that invasion with the launching of ballistic missiles, a verbal warning, and it's been followed by threats of a nuclear war if the West becomes directly involved in this war. And that coercion has had effect. I mean, you know the lines, Ia, no boots on the ground. You've reported regularly on how slow our assistance has flowed to the Ukrainians when it comes down to critical munitions, long-range strike, tanks, air defense systems, and such. So Putin has been able to exercise nuclear coercion with effect. And that, to me, is incredibly worrisome. It has weakened Ukraine's ability or limited Ukraine's ability to respond to this war. Second, it's a message to other countries around the world that nuclear coercion can be exercised with effect. That has a proliferation dynamic, not only among our adversaries who go, oh, my goodness, we can exercise nuclear coercion in the same way. Think of China and Taiwan and its plans for Taiwan. Think about Iran or other potential hegemons who are going, what do I need to do to prevent the West from meddling in my imperial ambitions? It affects the debate over the role of nuclear weapons in our allies. Look at the debate that's going on in South Korea. That's a democracy, that's a close ally. There's a debate over there whether or not they should have nuclear weapons to deter North Korea and China. So the proliferation dimension here. And then there's also a concern that I have about nuclear coercion actually leading to the exercise of nuclear weapons. If you reward nuclear coercion, you will see nuclear coercion exercised again and again. And in fact, that's what we've seen in the course of these last 2.5 years in Ukraine. And I fear that's human nature, that when you constantly repeat a threat, that's what nuclear coercion is, you increase the likelihood you actually exercise that threat.
So you're not excluding the possibility of Russia using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Is that what you're saying?
No, I think you cannot exclude that. It is a nuclear power, but you can exaggerate that threat, and you can also mismanage that threat, so to speak, when it comes to shaping your strategy to respond to aggression. And I think that's what's going on today. Putin has effectively used nuclear coercion to limit our support to Ukraine, and that has been to Ukraine's disadvantage.
Do you think we're doing enough? Do you think NATO is doing enough? And the United States, of course, to prevent this coercion, as you called it, or saber-rattling, as some experts call it. Is there anything different that the West should be doing in this regard?
I think that what the West should be doing is to increase its support to Ukraine. Demonstrate that the Ukrainians can not demonstrate, but enable the Ukrainians to win, to defeat the Russians, thereby demonstrating that nuclear coercion doesn't have effect. And I think there is room for us to responsibly manage that threat. Think about the imbalance of power that's at play here. We're talking about just the alliance alone, not the other partners in Europe and elsewhere that are supporting Ukraine. But NATO alone has a GDP of $54 trillion. That's compared to Russia's less than $2 trillion, a factor of 25. NATO spends $1.5 trillion this year on defense budgets. Russia, we don't know for sure, somewhere between 100, 120, 130 billion dollars, so a factor of 10. So the alliance is in the position to crush this invasion. And if we provided the Ukrainians the weapons at the rate they need, the type they need, without the restrictions we're placing on them, on their use against legitimate military targets in Russia, that would have effect. If we really amped up our economic sanctions on Russia, that would have effect. Russia is projected to grow by 3.2% this year. That's what it grew GDP-wise last year. If we really stepped up an information campaign, that would help have effect. If we were clear to Putin and also to the Ukrainians that we're going to bring them in to NATO, that they're no longer in a gray zone of ambiguity in Europe that leads Putin to conclude that he can sweep them off the map, place them under his control, that is a factor. Those combined elements would constitute a strategy that could enable the Ukrainians to win and to demonstrate that nuclear coercion does not work.
There is this perception or even public statements that the reason why Ukraine is now getting American long-range weapons is out of fear of escalation. We hear this word very often. How do you define it? What do you think the escalation means, especially in the context where a nuclear power is threatening a non-nuclear power with these weapons?
President Biden has been clear. President Trump was recently very clear that they fear that this war could escalate into a nuclear conflict. They're worried about doing something that would support Ukraine, that would provoke Russia into unleashing in some way a nuclear weapon. I think the threat is a serious one, but it's a manageable one. Again, this is a serious issue. You can't be flippant about this. And I think you can make a couple of assertions that are with a fair amount of degree of confidence. One, does it make sense for Putin to detonate a nuclear weapon on the very territory he claims is the heart of Russia? What will be the impact of such a detonation on the perceptions of the Russian people, who have a lot of relatives in Ukraine? What will be the battlefield impact of such a weapon? most military analysts and commanders that I talk to say it would be marginal. So you're not getting high military impact through the exercise of such a weapon. What would the impact be on Russia's allies and supporters? Probably distance them, because I don't think that his allies, so to speak, want to see that exercise. And then what risks would he be taking? What risks would he be catalyzing among his adversary, that is NATO allies? What is the risk that such an exercise of a nuclear weapon would provoke an even stronger response from the West? All these things lead me to believe that even Putin recognizes that an escalation of this sort is not to his own interests and would be counterproductive to his efforts to achieve, his control over Ukraine.
What do you think they are thinking? What is President Xi thinking when Russia is coming out with nuclear threats? And the context in which I'm asking you this question is, how is China viewing proliferation of nuclear weapons in its own region? Let's say Japan acquires nuclear weapons, or South Korea, or some other regional countries.
I think China would like to see this war continue indefinitely. In a way, Russia is certainly kind of a guinea pig for the Chinese. For one, the Chinese get to observe how Russian tactics, Russian equipment, maybe even some of the equipment they use, operate against NATO forces, against their primary adversary. They get to see how Western military equipment performs, their weaknesses, their performance parameters, where they're effective, where they're not. They get to observe and watch what's effective against those systems and what's not. Second, they get to see Allied inventories get drawn down, get emptied, leaving the United States, leaving Europe and its allies perhaps less militarily robust because of the costs of this war. Icing on the cake is they get to see Russia weakened by this. Because, I wouldn't consider any strategic partnership between two authoritarian states to be a truly stable one. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union is a good example of that. I'm not sure this is too different what we see between Russia and China. So weaker Russia is to Xi's advantage, and that's what this war is doing to Russia. It's not strengthening it; it's burning out the Russian military. I suspect, I don't know for sure, but there's indications the Chinese may have communicated to Putin that we don't support the use of a Russian nuclear weapon in this conflict. Probably for exactly the same reason you pointed out, that would have a proliferation dynamic that could be contrary to Xi's own interest, to China's interest. If nuclear weapons were to become a part of this this conflict, well, it's likely that other countries go, wow, we need to urgently get this. And you would have a nuclear South Korea, or perhaps others in the region that might go that direction out of fear of Chinese aggression. So that wouldn't be to Xi's interests.
Thank you very much for this. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
While nuclear threats from Russia may largely serve as a form of coercion designed to deter Western military involvement and slow aid to Ukraine, the possibility of escalation cannot be entirely dismissed. The mere suggestion of using nuclear weapons creates an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear, which has significant consequences for global stability. Glenn Howard, founder and former president of the Jamestown Foundation, has studied Russian military doctrine for years, including strategies on use of nuclear weapons. This is what he told us about the threats coming from the Kremlin. Glenn, thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome to the World Deciphered.
Well, thanks for having me. Great pleasure.
Let's start from, where do the nuclear weapons fit into the Russian military doctrine in general?
Well, I would say right now there's a period of great uncertainty and debate now in Russia. They're currently updating their nuclear strategy doctrine. And last week, the Kremlin strategist and well-known personality, Sergei Karganov, wrote an article in Kommersant that was basically nuclear saber-rattling. But his audience was not in the West, it was in Russia. And so he was arguing that Russia's not doing enough and needs to take a tougher position on its own nuclear doctrine, and it needs to wrap up its own internal assessments of the doctrine. And so this was quite surprising because he's always kind of very hawkish on these issues. And I think part of it was the timing of what is happening inside of Russia as Ukraine continues its ongoing operations inside of Russia in the Kursk region. And also not only the fact that Ukraine has started a second operation inside of Kursk, directly north of Sumy. And so what I think part of Ukraine's strategy is to show the West that there are no red lines for Russia, that showing basically that Russian threats of nuclear escalation are very hollow. It just seems that in the West that the elements of logic that you and I both have about Russian nuclear weapons strategy and this fear of escalation by the Biden administration, that anything they do in providing any type of assistance to Ukraine is going to meet this, escalatory response by Russia, which is shown again and again that it's very hollow. There's a lot of saber-rattling and not a lot of action in terms of what Russia's saying. And so we become hostage of our fears.
You're saying that it's just rhetoric and you don't expect escalation from the Russian side. Did I understand you right?
Yes, that is correct. And that there's this area of vagueness in terms of what he's saying and then how we will respond. And Putin knows this. He knows that there's a concern among certain sections of the Biden cabinet, and including the president, that they have this inherent concern of World War III. And he's used it very effectively. And he's used it very effectively with some Republicans. So it's not just confined to one party. And it's a valid concern. But the facts don't really match in that direction. For example, if Putin was really ready to make a nuclear response and a statement, he could detonate a nuclear explosion at Novaya Zemlya in the Arctic. There's been years of speculation that they've been wanting to resume nuclear testing again. And so one of those first targets would be to conduct a nuclear test in the Arctic. It'd be safe. It'd be a very effective way of showing the West that he's serious, but he didn't do it. And so, the things that he resorts to are very, in my opinion, very hollow and not backed up by facts and not backed up by the Russian military, which is increasingly unable to be able to respond to these types of asymmetric threats that Ukraine is posing to Russia.
How would you compare NATO's nuclear capabilities and those of Russia's? And where do you think this balance or power balance between NATO and Russia from the nuclear standpoint fits into this conversation that we're having now, whether Russia is likely to use nukes or not?
Well, NATO's nuclear capabilities are significant. I'm not an expert and can't get into kilotons and talk about delivery systems and all that. But what I would say is that the West and NATO have done a very dismal job even at reminding Russia that it has nuclear weapons. I mean, they won't even flaunt it in the way that Putin has. I mean, not by flaunt, but it'd be a subtle reminder to remind Putin that we have nuclear weapons as well. I mean, so two can play this game, and you don't have to. The statement doesn't have to be escalatory. It can be certainly very subtle, and certainly we've been demonstrated in the past that we were willing to do this.
Do you think this increases or decreases the risk of any sort of miscommunication, any sort of miscalculation about nuclear use?
Well, this is the people who support the view that anything we do could be viewed as escalatory. Is certainly that takes hold over how people how they respond. And so the United States, since the Vietnam War, has been has had this policy of where they try to avoid escalation, but yet they find themselves sinking deeper and deeper into taking actions that can be viewed as escalatory. And so, in other words, the Biden administration 6 months ago was not willing to give Ukraine F-16s, or a year ago. Now they're doing it. And so they constantly are backtracking in terms of how they respond, how they try to deal with this issue. And then they find themselves ending up doing the exact same thing that they were saying 6 months or a year ago that they weren't willing to do. Meanwhile, Ukraine keeps suffering every day. I mean, the point is that Russia can end this war. It's up to them to end it, but Ukraine can only end the war if it's no longer Ukraine.
What do you think the messaging is or was from China about nuclear weapons to Russia? And what do you think China is learning from this, specifically from the nuclear coercion side that we're witnessing from Russia at this point?
Well, I think China has restrained itself in some ways. They have not turned fully their arms production online to help Russia. In some ways, they've restrained that. There are reports that China, in the media, in the Western media, that China has warned Russia behind closed doors not to use nuclear weapons. Okay. But China is a very dangerous factor in the war because of the supply lines. That there's a report earlier this week that I saw inside Ukraine that China has opened one of its production lines for ammunition to Russia, and that could account for some the recent surge in ammunition that the Ukrainians have seen showing up in the conflict. Now, if that's true, that's very dangerous. That would show that the Biden administration, despite its policy of engagement with Xi, has been counterproductive. And recently, a week ago, you saw reports of the Russians transporting ballistic missiles from Iran to Russia. Okay, and the Caspian Sea has certainly become an area, a part of this interior line of communication between Russia and Iran, has become allies, helping to offset Russian production deficits. North Korea has stepped in and done this. Now, your question is about nuclear weapons and about the role of China, but I'm painting a bigger picture here. The picture is of the area you know well, I know well, is Eurasia. It's a vast area where the United States is not exercising its full strategic capabilities, and in fact, some ways is siding with Armenia against Azerbaijan. And the U.S. actually used to have military cooperation agreement on non-proliferation with Azerbaijan, and it's completely got rid of that. So because of that, the Russians can, with impunity, use the Caspian as its own internal lake to transport these Iranian ballistic missiles back and forth to help improve its own capabilities against Ukraine. Meanwhile, in Siberia, you have the Russians transporting North Korean ammunition and strategic ballistic missiles and whatever, most importantly, ammunition, and it's helping to offset their disadvantage in the war. Now, in a larger conflict between NATO and the West, this matters because the West doesn't have an effective means to interdict or stop this. So the essence of your question is that there's no strategy in Eurasia for this administration, and I don't even know if the future administration, whoever it is, will have that. But it's up for people like you and I to talk about this.
There is a fear that nuclear coercion and repeating the threats of nuclear use would eventually one day lead to some sort of use of nuclear weapons, at least a tactical nuclear weapon. First of all, do you agree with that? That's one part of the question. And the second part is, if the nuclear weapons were to be used, particularly by Russia and Ukraine, what impact or what would be the consequences of that use, in your view?
The problem in the United States now and in Europe is that there's very few Russian nuclear expertise available. And whatever expertise is available is not well known or understood in the high levels of the U.S. government. Nuclear policy and strategy has fallen to the wayside in the West. And so the ability to even interpret and understand what the Russian response policy would be is very limited. Now, there is some closed-door discussion on it, but the American audiences and experts in Washington don't know this area very well. Now, if Karagonov's article is correct, it means that the Russians, they themselves, haven't even worked out their own nuclear strategy. I mean, he is saying so openly in the Russian press. So to understand your opponent and how the Russians would respond and what they would do, you have to understand their mental mindset and their strategic writings on doctrine, nuclear doctrine in this case. You have to understand what it is. In the U.S. government and policy circles, there's a very poor understanding of nuclear weapons strategy to begin with. During the Reagan administration, the height of the 80s, Democratic and Republican administrations, they understood what it was. They had a look at the writings on the topic, very vast and voluminous, but not now. You don't see occasionally there's articles in the U.S. media about the use of nuclear weapons and what their strategy would be. That's great. That's a great starting point, but it's very modest at best.
Former Deputy National Security Advisor Matthew Pottinger is among many leading national security voices who are warning that an invasion of Taiwan by Chinese forces would be catastrophic, and not only for Taiwan, but also for democracies around the world. The distinguished visiting fellow at Stanford University sat down recently with Cipher Brief CEO and publisher Suzanne to talk about why the focus today needs to be on a strategy of deterrence before it's too late.
Matt Pottinger, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
You're currently a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, which is where I assume you based out of for work on your new book, The Boiling Moat: Urgent Steps to Defend Taiwan. But before that, you served in the White House for 4 years in a variety, really, of senior roles, including as Deputy National Security Advisor during the Trump administration. And you really focused a lot on the pivot of U.S. policy toward China during that time. So I wanted to start off, Matt, by just asking you, why this book and why right now?
Yeah, so that's right. I've been working as a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution out at Stanford, and got a lot of support from colleagues there and inspiration to write a book that we call The Boiling Moat: Urgent Steps to Defend Taiwan, with an emphasis on urgent, because we think that we're seeing a deterioration of deterrence. Generally, you saw it with the invasion of Ukraine. You've seen it with the October 7 attacks on Israel and all of the strikes on U.S. troops and on U.S. ships and international shipping since then. You're even seeing it with China in the South China Sea vis-a-vis the Philippines, and their increasingly aggressive posture toward Taiwan. So we thought that the timing was certainly, if anything, past due to write about what concrete steps we believe the United States, but also Taiwan and Japan and Australia and Europe need to take in order to shore up our flagging deterrence.
I really love the way that you've kind of broken the book down into these sections too, because it almost reads like a blueprint for how to deter China. You have multiple authors participating in these chapters and how they come together. And as you mentioned, it's almost really just an instruction guide for what each of these continents and countries need to do when it comes to defending Taiwan. So could you take just a moment and describe the true sense of urgency here? I mean, you already mentioned a lot of the incidents that are happening around the globe that are kind of raising the level of awareness, but why is this an urgent matter right now?
Yeah, it's urgent because if we look at what Xi Jinping is saying and we look at what he's doing, those are the two ingredients that tell me that we're on a collision course right now. Number one, he has expressed to my ears his intention to, as he puts it, solve the Taiwan question. He has equated unification with Taiwan with as being what he calls the essence of his vision. For what he calls the great rejuvenation of the Chinese ethnos, or the Chinese nation. He told President Biden last fall when they met in San Francisco that he expects the United States to support his goal of unifying Taiwan under the PRC flag, in essence. And so I take very seriously his rhetoric, both when he's talking to U.S. leaders, but also when he's talking to his own system. He is using formulations and language that his predecessors did not use, especially in terms of timing, talking about sort of an impatient view that this is not something that can now be pushed on from generation to generation. Whereas Deng Xiaoping, back in the 80s, he said, look, if it takes 100 or 1,000 years, we've got time. So that's on the intention side of the ledger. And then in terms of capabilities, Beijing is building the largest military ever built in peacetime since the 1930s, really since the Third Reich under Adolf Hitler during peacetime in the 30s. So why? I think we have to ask that question. And so I think that we're now looking at a no one really knows the timeline. Only Xi Jinping knows, and perhaps he even will still make adjustments. I don't think he's a reckless gambler, and therefore I'm actually one of those. Actually, my co-authors and I are more or less to a person optimistic that if we were as allies and partners to take the steps that we recommend in the book, that in fact Xi Jinping is susceptible to being deterred, and he's not going to move recklessly into a situation unless he's fairly confident in advance about the outcome. So it's up to us to show him that he should not have confidence in the outcome of a dangerous gamble, a throwing of the iron dice, as it were.
Yeah. You talk a lot about deterrence in the book, and I want to read something from the opening chapter titled "The Stormy Seas of a Major Test." You say, if just one lesson could be drawn from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it must be that deterrence would have been a lot cheaper than war, yet democracies seem to be getting worse at deterrence. Talk to me a little bit about what you think Xi Jinping is seeing when he looks at how the world, particularly the West, is responding to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that we are responding as an alliance, the NATO countries and others, to shore up Ukraine's defense of its sovereignty, and I'm quite confident that Xi Jinping is watching to see how that goes. But he has made a determination that it is in his interest to provide massive support for Russia's war effort. And we saw that finally recognized publicly by the NATO countries when they put out a statement just a few months ago that said that China is the, quote, decisive enabler of this war on the Russian side. So Beijing is, one, wants to see Russia win this fight. Two, has calculated that there won't be repercussions for Beijing if it provides massive, overwhelming military support, material support, not troops, but all of the things that go into making the weapons that are killing hundreds of thousands of people, men, women, and children on the battlefield and in cities. And so that is another failure of deterrence. The fact that we were unable to persuade Xi Jinping that he should not actually be the decisive enabler of a war in Europe is yet another failure of deterrence, and it's one that he is exploiting. So we're having compounding failures of deterrence at this point. We failed to deter Vladimir Putin. He was not impressed with President Biden's olive branch that he extended at the beginning of his administration. Remember, President Biden suspended providing lethal weaponry to Ukraine. And he also lifted the sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which gave Russia confidence that Europe needed gas more than it needed sovereignty, that it was willing to forego the sovereignty of a European nation in exchange for cheaper gas. So we sent all the wrong signals, but now we have a compounding problem of Iran providing thousands of these kamikaze drones that are really changing the character of warfare. Beijing being the decisive enabler. So again, we failed to deter Russia, but now we're failing to deter the countries that are the primary sponsors and supporters of the war. So deterrence is a art, and it appears to be one that is perishable over the course of the last generation. Since we brought the Cold War to a successful and peaceful conclusion, we've lost some of that muscle tone. We've forgotten what it takes. That expressing the desire for peace does not actually enhance peace, the paradox of deterrence is you have to show that you have the resolve and the capability to inflict serious pain on your adversaries, on aggressors or would-be aggressors, in order to give them pause before they actually roll the dice and engage in aggression.
Matthew Pottinger is the editor of a new book titled The Boiling Moat: Urgent Steps to Defend Taiwan. Matt, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And that's it for this week's episode of The World Deciphered. I'm your host, Iya Meormashuli. Remember, you can watch the full interviews with each of our guests on the Cipher Brief's YouTube channel. Be sure to join us again next week for more of the deep insights and expert analysis that you've come to expect from the Cipher Brief. And visit us at decipherbrief.com, where you can subscribe to our open source report, keeping you up to speed on what's happening in the world every Monday through Friday. Because national security is everyone's business.